31 years ago, an entire ballet team vanished without a trace. The young dancers, full of dreams and talent, were last seen boarding a bus with their beloved coach. Parents waited for their children to return, but they never did. Days turned into weeks, and the case faded into a heartbreaking mystery until one man, searching for his past, stumbled upon a truth no one was ready for. At the same time, in a completely different part of the country, a small moment of kindness was unfolding, one that would change a young man's life forever. A teenage boy, exhausted from a long day, noticed a pregnant woman struggling to stand on a crowded bus. Without hesitation, he gave up his seat, expecting nothing in return. But what happened next left him speechless. The woman handed him a note, one that would alter his future in ways he could never have imagined. These two stories, seemingly unrelated, are tied together by fate, mystery, and the power of human choices. What happened to the ballet team all those years ago? And what was written on that note that changed a teenager's life forever? The answers will leave you stunned. But before we uncover the truth, let's go back to where it all began. The year was 1993. The city was alive with excitement as the regional ballet championship approached. Among the many teams preparing for the competition was a promising group of young dancers from a small but respected academy. Their coach, Elena Markov, was known for her dedication and passion. She had trained them for months, pushing them to their limits, shaping them into a team that could take on anyone. Parents and friends gathered outside the academy the morning of their departure. The bus stood ready, gleaming under the early sun. The dancers, dressed in warm-ups and carrying their bags, hugged their families, promising to return with a trophy. Laughter and chatter filled the air as they boarded the bus, excited for the journey ahead. Elena did a final head count, ensuring everyone was there. Then, with a wave to the parents, the driver shut the doors, and the bus rolled away. That was the last time anyone saw them. When the team failed to arrive at the competition, panic spread among the organizers. Calls were made, routes were checked, but there was no sign of the bus. Authorities were alerted, and soon, a full-scale search was underway. Helicopters scanned the roads, police questioned witnesses, and volunteers combed through nearby towns. But the bus had vanished, no accidents, no wreckage, no trace of where it had gone. Parents clung to hope, believing their children would be found. Days turned into weeks, then months. The story faded from the news, leaving only whispers of conspiracy and unanswered questions. Some believed it was a planned escape, others spoke of something more sinister. But without evidence, the case eventually became just another cold mystery. Decades later, a man named Daniel Carter was searching for his father's past. His father, who had worked as a truck driver in the 90s, had passed away, leaving behind boxes of old journals and maps. As Daniel sifted through them, he found something odd: an old, worn-out notebook filled with scribbled notes and road sketches. But what caught his attention was a page with frantic handwriting, repeating the same words over and over. "I saw them. I saw the bus." Daniel's heart pounded as he flipped through the pages. There were descriptions of a bus parked in an abandoned warehouse, names of places, and a date, March 27, 1993. The same day the ballet team vanished. Meanwhile, in a different part of the country, a teenager named Jordan sat on a crowded city bus, exhausted after a long shift at his after-school job. He worked hard to support his mother and younger sister, often coming home late with sore feet and empty pockets. That evening, as he leaned against the window, he noticed a pregnant woman struggling to hold onto the handrail. Without thinking, he stood up and gestured for her to take his seat. She hesitated, giving him a soft smile before accepting. As the bus rumbled through the streets, Jordan didn't expect anything in return. But just as he was about to get off at his stop, the woman reached into her bag and handed him a small, folded note. "Open it when you get home," she said gently. Curious but tired, Jordan tucked the note into his pocket and got off the bus. The night was quiet as he walked to his apartment, his mind already occupied with thoughts of school, work, and the never-ending struggle to keep things together. He almost forgot about the note until he reached into his pocket while changing into his worn-out pajamas. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, almost too perfect. But it was the words that made his breath catch. Meet me at the corner of 5th and Maple tomorrow at noon. This will change your life. Jordan frowned, staring at the note in disbelief. Who was she? What did she mean? And why would a stranger want to meet him? He lay awake that night, unable to shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. A mystery was unfolding right in front of him, and he had no idea where it would lead. And somewhere, miles away, Daniel Carter sat at his father's old desk, staring at the faded words in the notebook. His father had seen something that no one else had, and he was about to find out what it was. The next morning, Daniel Carter sat at his kitchen table, the old notebook open in front of him. His father had never spoken much about his past, and now, decades after the ballet team's disappearance, this was the first real clue anyone had found. He traced his fingers over the faded ink, trying to make sense of the rushed notes. If his father had seen the bus, why hadn't he ever told anyone? And more importantly, what had happened to it afterward? The location written in the notebook wasn't far, a remote area outside of town where abandoned warehouses and empty fields stretched for miles. It was the kind of place people rarely visited, forgotten by time. His father's old truck routes passed through that area, which meant he must have seen something no one else had. Daniel knew he couldn't just ignore this. He had to go there himself. Meanwhile, miles away, Jordan Carter hesitated as he stood at the corner of 5th and Maple. He had almost convinced himself not to come, that the note was some kind of joke. But something deep inside told him otherwise. The streets were busy, cars rushing by, people hurrying to work or running errands. He glanced around, looking for the woman from the bus. Then, he saw her. She stood near a small cafe, her coat pulled tightly around her. She wasn't as old as he had thought, maybe in her mid-30s, with tired eyes and an expression that seemed both nervous and determined. As he approached, she looked up and gave him a small nod. "You came," she said softly. Jordan shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, you said this would change my life." She took a deep breath. "Before I explain, I need to ask, do you know who your father is?" The question hit Jordan like a punch. He barely remembered his father. He had left when Jordan was a toddler, and his mother never spoke about him. It was as if he had never existed. "What does that have to do with anything?" Jordan asked, suddenly on edge. The woman hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph. "Because I think he was part of something dangerous." Jordan stared at the photo. It was grainy, but he recognized his mother immediately, younger, standing beside a man he had never seen before. And yet, there was something familiar about him. Back in the outskirts of town, Daniel pulled up to the location written in his father's notebook. The warehouse was barely standing, its rusted metal walls peeling from years of neglect. He hesitated before stepping out of his car. The air was thick, heavy with silence. This place had been abandoned for decades, but as he walked closer, something felt off. The doors to the warehouse were locked, but a side window was broken, just large enough for him to squeeze through. Inside, dust covered every surface, but as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something strange: old footprints in the dirt, like someone had been there recently. He moved carefully, scanning the room, until his foot hit something hard. A metal plate, slightly raised from the floor. Heart pounding, he knelt down and brushed away the dust. There was a handle. He gripped it and pulled. The sound of rusted metal scraping echoed through the empty space. Beneath the plate was a dark hole, a hidden underground chamber. Daniel reached for his phone, turning on the flashlight. As the beam cut through the darkness, his breath caught in his throat. There, at the bottom of the hidden space, was a row of ballet shoes, perfectly lined up. Back in the city, Jordan was still processing what he was seeing. The woman watched him closely, as if waiting for his reaction. "Who are you?" he finally asked. She exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath. "My name is Sarah. And I think your father might be the only one who knows the truth about what happened to my sister." Jordan felt a chill run down his spine. "Your sister?" Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with pain. "She was one of the dancers. One of the ones who vanished 31 years ago." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jordan's heart was racing, his mind struggling to keep up. What did his father have to do with this? He had never been part of his life, so how could he be connected to something that happened decades ago? I don't know what you think I can do, Jordan finally said. Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. I think your father left behind something important. Something that could finally explain what happened. Jordan shook his head. He wasn't even around. My mom never talked about him. Sarah bit her lip. That's because she was probably trying to protect you. Jordan clenched his fists. He didn't know what to believe, but he did know one thing: nothing in his life had ever felt this strange, this unreal. And yet, somehow, he knew he couldn't walk away from it now. At the same time, Daniel climbed down into the underground space. The ballet shoes weren't the only things there. Along the walls were shelves stacked with boxes, old, dusty, forgotten. He reached for one, carefully opening the lid. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Pictures of the missing dancers, some taken in the ballet studio, others at competitions. But these weren't ordinary photos. They looked recent. Like someone had been keeping track of them long after they had disappeared. And then, at the bottom of the box, he found something that made his blood run cold. A photo of his father, standing with Elena Markov, the ballet coach. The date on the back. 2 years after the team had vanished. Daniel's hands trembled as he held the photograph. His father stood beside Elena Markov, both of them looking serious, almost tense. The fact that this photo existed at all made no sense. The world believed Elena and her ballet team had vanished in 1993, so why was there proof that she was alive 2 years later? And why had his father kept it hidden all these years? A rush of fear settled in Daniel's chest. He had grown up thinking his father was just an ordinary man, a truck driver who had worked long hours to support his family. But now, it seemed he had been part of something much bigger, something dark. The notebook, the frantic scribbles, the mention of the bus. What had he seen? What had he been involved in? He stuffed the photo back into the box and scanned the other items. More papers, more records, some of them marked with strange symbols and dates. His father had documented something he had been afraid of. But why had he never told anyone? A sound from above made Daniel freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone else was in the warehouse. He quickly shut the box and turned off his flashlight, pressing himself against the wall. The footsteps grew closer, stopping near the open metal plate. He could hear the faint sound of breathing. Whoever was up there knew about this place. And now, they knew someone else had found it. Meanwhile, across the city, Jordan felt a weight pressing down on him as he stared at Sarah. Her words lingered in his mind, clashing against everything he had ever known. His father, who had abandoned him and his mother, was now somehow tied to a decades-old disappearance. It didn't make sense. Sarah studied his reaction. I know this is a lot, she said, her voice softer now. But I need you to listen. I think your father was part of something that he didn't want you to know about. Something dangerous. Jordan shook his head. How do you even know that? Sarah reached into her bag again, pulling out another piece of paper. It was old, yellowed at the edges. Jordan took it hesitantly and unfolded it. His stomach flipped when he saw the handwriting. He had only seen it a few times in his life, on the rare occasions his father had sent him birthday cards. The note was short, hurried, as if written in a moment of panic. If anything happens to me, don't trust them. Protect the boy. Jordan swallowed hard. Who wrote this? Sarah met his eyes. Your father. His hands tightened around the paper. His father had written this note, warning someone. Warning about him. But why? Before he could ask, Sarah leaned in. I know where your father used to go before he disappeared. An old warehouse outside the city. Jordan's heart pounded. What do you mean, disappeared? Sarah hesitated. He vanished 15 years ago. Just gone. No one ever found him. The words sent a chill through Jordan. His mother had told him that his father had left and never looked back. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if he hadn't abandoned them? What if something had happened to him? His pulse raced as the weight of everything hit him at once. He had spent his whole life thinking he was just another kid with a missing dad. But now, It seemed like his father had been caught in something dangerous. And somehow, it all led back to that ballet team from 31 years ago. Sarah watched him carefully. If you want answers, we have to go now. Jordan took a shaky breath. His life had always been about survival, working, helping his mom, making sure his sister had food on the table. He had never had time to think about the past. But now, the past was chasing him, pulling him into something he didn't understand. He met Sarah's gaze. Let's go. Back in the warehouse, Daniel barely breathed as the footsteps above moved again. He pressed himself into the shadows, heart pounding. A voice, low and unfamiliar, spoke. Someone's been here. Another voice responded, quieter but firm. Check everything. If they found the boxes, we have a problem. Daniel's pulse quickened. Whoever they weren't random trespassers. They knew about the underground chamber, about the records. They were looking for something. And if they found him, they would know he had seen it too. He scanned the room, searching for a way out. The chamber had no back exit, just the ladder leading up. If he tried to climb out now, they would see him. He had to wait. But how long? Above him, the men moved, their footsteps growing more insistent. One of them kicked a box, sending dust scattering. It's still here, the first voice said. But someone went through it. Daniel's stomach tightened. They knew. He had to get out. He had to find Jordan. Because if his father had been warning someone, if he had spent years hiding the truth, then Daniel wasn't the only one in danger. Jordan was too. Daniel's breath was shallow as he stayed perfectly still in the dark chamber. Above him, the voices moved closer. Dust from the ceiling drifted down, tickling his nose, but he didn't dare move. The men were searching, their movements sharp and methodical. These weren't just trespassers. They had a purpose. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Check the floor, one of them said. If he's still here, he won't have gotten far. Daniel's heart pounded. They were looking for him. He scanned the underground space for anything he could use. The walls were lined with old metal shelves, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and rust. He spotted an old, rusted pipe leaning against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Above, the men continued their search. The metal plate covering the chamber entrance scraped slightly, as if someone was testing its weight. Daniel tightened his grip on the pipe. If they lifted the plate and found him, he'd have no choice but to fight. But then, just as he braced himself, another voice echoed through the warehouse, one that didn't belong to the men. Hey, who's in there? The footsteps stopped. A pause filled the air, thick with uncertainty. Daniel recognized the voice immediately. Jordan. He felt both relief and panic at once. Jordan wasn't supposed to be here, he had no idea what he was walking into. One of the men cursed under his breath. We need to go. Now. Daniel barely had time to process what was happening before the footsteps rushed toward the exit. A door slammed. Then silence. Slowly, Daniel exhaled, his muscles aching from the tension. He waited a few more seconds before climbing up the ladder, carefully pushing the metal plate aside. Jordan stood near the entrance, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. Sarah was behind him, glancing around the warehouse like she expected something to jump out at them. Daniel pulled himself up and dusted off his hands. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice still shaking with adrenaline. Jordan lifted an eyebrow. I could ask you the same thing. Daniel hesitated, then held up the photo he had found. Your father knew something. About the missing ballet team. About all of this. Jordan took the photo, his fingers tightening around the edges. His father, standing beside Elena Markov. The date on the back staring at him like a challenge. That doesn't make sense, Jordan muttered. He disappeared years ago. How was he involved in this? Daniel shook his head. I don't know. But those guys. They were looking for something. I think they've been watching this place, waiting for someone to find it. Sarah stepped forward, her face pale. If they knew your dad had information, maybe that's why he disappeared. Maybe he was trying to protect you. Jordan swallowed, his thoughts racing. His whole life, he had believed his father had simply walked away. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if he had been taken? Before he could say anything, Daniel reached into the box again, pulling out another set of papers. He flipped through them quickly, stopping when he saw something that made his breath catch. It was a list. Names. The entire ballet team, along with dates beside each one. Some were from 1993, but others. Daniel's blood ran cold. Some of the dates were recent. These names, he whispered. They didn't just disappear. They were being tracked. Jordan stared at the list, his stomach twisting. You mean some of them might still be alive? Daniel didn't answer right away. His mind was spinning. If the ballet team hadn't died, if they had been taken instead, then the question wasn't just what happened 31 years ago. It was why. And whoever was behind it wasn't finished. Daniel's hands tightened around the list, his pulse racing. The truth was worse than he had imagined. The ballet team hadn't simply vanished, they had been tracked for years. Some of them might still be alive. But if that were true, where had they been all this time? And why had no one spoken out? Jordan was staring at the paper, his mind spinning. His father's name wasn't on the list, but the implications were clear. If his dad had known the truth, if he had been trying to protect someone, that meant someone else had been trying to silence him. Sarah stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. If some of them are still out there, we need to find them before those men do. Before Daniel could respond, a noise cut through the silence. Footsteps, fast, urgent. Not from outside, but inside the warehouse. Someone had stayed behind. The three of them barely had time to react before a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and gaunt, with a face lined by years of exhaustion. His clothes were worn, his hair unkempt, but his eyes were burning with something fierce. Jordan froze. He knew that face. He had seen it in old photos. Dad. His voice cracked, barely believing the word as it left his mouth. The man exhaled sharply, his expression filled with something between relief and fear. Jordan. Jordan's legs felt weak. His father was standing right in front of him. The man he had spent his entire life thinking had abandoned him. Daniel and Sarah exchanged quick glances, both understanding the weight of this moment. But there was no time for questions. The truth was right in front of them, and they had to take it before it disappeared again. You were supposed to be gone, Jordan whispered, his throat dry. Mom said you left us. His father shook his head, pain flashing in his eyes. I had to leave. They were coming for me. And if I stayed, they would have come for you too. Daniel took a step forward, holding up the photograph. You knew Elena Markov. Jordan's father swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. I didn't just know her. I tried to save her. Silence fell between them. Sarah's hands trembled. Then where is she? Where are the others? Jordan's father hesitated, then looked toward the far end of the warehouse. Follow me. They had no reason to trust him, but something in his voice, in his weary eyes, told them they had no choice. He led them through a narrow passage in the warehouse, behind a stack of old crates. Hidden beneath a top was another entrance, a heavy metal door, almost like the kind you'd see in a bunker. Daniel's stomach twisted. This place was bigger than they had realized. Jordan's father punched in a code on a rusted keypad. The door clicked open. As it swung inward, a gust of stale air hit them. The space beyond was dimly lit, cold, and eerily silent. Jordan's heart pounded as they stepped inside. And then, they saw them. Rows of old cots, each one covered with thin blankets. A few chairs scattered around, a table with empty food trays. It looked like an old shelter. But the real shock came when movement stirred in the shadows. A woman, frail but alert, stepped forward. Her face was lined with age, her dark eyes filled with recognition. Sarah gasped. Elena. The woman's lips parted in disbelief. She took a shaky step forward. Who are you? Daniel barely found his voice. We're here because of my father, and his. He motioned toward Jordan. Elena's gaze flickered to Jordan's father, and something unreadable passed between them. She exhaled, her shoulders sagging. You shouldn't have come here, she whispered. If they find you, they'll never let you leave. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Who? Who's after you? Elena hesitated, then motioned for them to follow. You need to see for yourself. She led them deeper into the bunker, past a heavy curtain. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. There, sitting in small clusters, were the missing dancers. Not all of them, some were older now, others frail, but they were there. Alive. Sarah covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Oh my God. Jordan turned to his father, his voice shaking. You knew they were here. All these years. His father's face darkened. I didn't just know. I helped hide them. Daniel's mind reeled. From who? Jordan's father exhaled, his voice heavy. The same people who were just here. The ones looking for you. Before anyone could process what that meant, the sound of tires screeching outside sent their hearts racing. They had been found. Panic settled over the room in an instant. The screeching tires outside meant only one thing: whoever had been searching the warehouse before had come back, and this time, they knew exactly where to look. Jordan's father reacted first, rushing to the door and bolting it shut. They found us, he muttered under his breath. Elena gripped Daniel's arm, her fingers cold and trembling. There's another way out, she whispered. But we have to move. Now. Daniel, Jordan, and Sarah barely had time to process what was happening before Elena turned and motioned for the others, what remained of her ballet team, to follow. They moved quickly, fear pressing against them like a heavy weight. Jordan turned to his father. Are you coming? His father hesitated for just a moment. Then he nodded. I'm not leaving you again. Sarah grabbed a flashlight from a nearby crate as Elena led them through the bunker. The hallways were narrow, lined with old supplies and rusted metal shelves. The air smelled damp, like the walls had absorbed decades of fear and waiting. Outside, footsteps echoed against the concrete. Whoever was out there wasn't just looking anymore. They were coming in. Daniel's pulse pounded as Elena pushed open a metal grate in the floor, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward into darkness. This leads to the old drainage system, she said. It's how we've stayed hidden. One by one, they climbed down. Jordan's father went last, pulling the grate shut just as voices shouted from the warehouse above. The tunnel was damp, the walls slick with moisture. The only light came from Sarah's flashlight, casting eerie shadows ahead. The group moved as quickly as they could, the silence thick between them. Finally, after what felt like forever, they reached another metal ladder. Elena climbed first, pushing open a rusted hatch above. The fresh night air rushed in. They emerged in a clearing surrounded by trees. The warehouse was now just a shadow in the distance, but the tension hadn't left their bodies. Jordan turned to his father. Tell me everything, he said, his voice firm. His father ran a hand down his face, the weight of years pressing down on him. I was part of the transport crew back then. I didn't know the full truth at first, just that we were moving people who weren't supposed to exist anymore. He swallowed hard. But when I saw Elena and the others, when I realized they weren't being rescued but taken, I knew I couldn't be a part of it. Elena's voice was quiet. He risked his life to get us out. To hide us. Jordan's chest tightened. His whole life, he had believed his father had abandoned him. But in reality, he had been running from people who would have hurt them all if they had known the truth. Daniel exhaled, looking at the fragile, exhausted survivors around him. Why did they take you? He asked Elena. Why go through all of this? Elena's eyes darkened. Because we saw something we weren't supposed to. She didn't elaborate, but the look in her eyes said enough. Daniel felt the weight of the papers still in his pocket, the list of names, the dates. Evidence that these people had never been forgotten, just erased. Sarah looked toward the road ahead. We need to get out of here before they realize we're gone. Jordan nodded, glancing at his father. Where do we go? His father hesitated before saying, I have a contact. Someone who can help. But we can't stop moving. The group disappeared into the night, leaving behind the warehouse, the bunker, and 3 decades of buried secrets. By morning, news reports would break about a fire at an abandoned warehouse. No bodies found. No records left behind. Another attempt to erase what had been uncovered. But this time, the truth had survived. Daniel held the photograph tighter as they drove away, knowing that everything had changed. They had escaped, but the story wasn't over. Some secrets refused to stay hidden forever.